Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this A34 Comet Mark 1A. This is a 1/72nd scale plastic kit from Vespid Models. Vespid is a pretty new company and this is one of their initial releases, the other being the mouse which I looked at last year. They've also since released another variant of the Comet and an anti-air mouse. Of course that never existed, but it's still pretty cool. Anyway, today we're looking at this Comet. There's nothing on the back of the box, which is pretty common for scale models like this. I'm not sure why we keep looking. At least the art on the front of the box is pretty cool. Inside the box we find 3 sprues moulded in grey plastic. These are really nice looking sprues. They're very neat and crisply moulded and the detail is great. That's pretty obvious to see and you don't really need me to tell you that, but I'm doing it anyway. You're welcome. Even though these are very neat, there is still mould lines that you'll need to remove, and you'll probably have to do some tidying up around where you clip the parts off the sprues as well, but that's not really going to be all that much work anyway. Something cool about these parts is that there is slide moulding for the guns, even the machine guns. That's a really nice feature, and something I don't often encounter at this scale, especially the machine guns, though you totally don't have to use this plastic main gun. We'll see the metal one in a bit. There are 2 sprues full of wheels and tracks. Like the rest of the parts, these are really nice and neat. If you saw the Vespid mouse video, you'll know that I had issues with the tracks in that kit. Hopefully these ones go on a lot easier. Like with the guns, there's also some slide moulding here for the return rollers. This makes for some really nicely detailed return rollers. The lower hull is its own non-sprue mounted loose part, and it's very good. There's a bunch of nice suspension detail, which is very cool, even though this will almost entirely be hidden once the model is together. It's still cool that it's there though. I do like that the parts the wheels mount onto are part of the hull. This means they should go on really nice and straight, and that will help with track installation. The turret is also a single piece, and it's quite well detailed for being a single piece. Even the fire extinguishers on the back are moulded in place without looking bad. I think it's fair to say that I'm impressed with the plastic in this kit. In addition to that plastic, there is some photo etch. Some of these parts are simple and some will need some bending, and in all honesty I think a few of these parts would have been better if they were in plastic. But they're not plastic, they're photo etch, so that's what we've got and that's what we'll work with. The main gun here is a shiny piece of, well, I guess it's brass, owing to the colour. This is a very nice gun. I do like the inclusion of metal gun barrels in these Vespid kits and I do hope they continue that. There is also, as we saw before, the plastic gun that you could use, and it's nice that there's an option. I wish there were the same options with the photo etch. Maybe in the future. There is of course a decal sheet included, and there's not really a wide range of markings here, but they'll do the trick and they should look pretty good. I've not used any of Vespid's decals yet, so I can't speak of their quality yet, but I'm sure they're decent enough. And so that we know how to put this thing together, we have instructions. These are, for the most part, pretty decent. They're well laid out and easy enough to follow, but if I had one complaint, it's where the photo etch needs bending, the instructions don't really show you how to do that. It is kind of a minor complaint, but I think it's worth pointing out. Otherwise, everything's quite clear and easy to use. There's also a couple of basic painting and marking guides which are, well, basic, but they could still be helpful. Let's now use these instructions to guide us in the gluing of bits of plastic to each other. We start with the lower hull, onto which we glue the outer hull side parts, which does hide the majority of the suspension. I find as many points of contact as I can and add glue to them. Then the side parts more or less just drop right into place. I apply a little pressure to make sure the bonds are good and solid, and that's done. Next, shackles. In an effort to be neat with the glue, I apply it to the shackles themselves, and then attach them to the brackets on the rear of the hull. I try to position them in such a way that they'll look like they're hanging straight down because of gravity. That's the sort of thing gravity does. Now it's time for our first bit of photo etch. These little handle-looking things that go on the boxes on the hull rear, which I'm pretty sure are smoke generators. Again, to try and avoid making a mess, I apply glue to the photo etch parts, and then use tweezers to put them in place. It was a bit fiddly and I did actually knock them off a couple of times while working on this model, but I think I got them in more or less the right place. I add the return rollers next, and these are rather good looking parts, and they go into place very easily, though there is a little bit of play to these, so you'll have to nudge them until they look as straight as you can get them, but that isn't too difficult. Obviously there are return rollers for both sides of the hull, so try not to forget them. The drive sprockets come next, and I was a bit annoyed by the sprue gates here. They're right over 2 of the teeth for each sprocket, which obviously creates a challenge when removing them from the sprue and cleaning them up. Putting them together, however, is as easy as could be. The guide pins make sure the teeth line up with each other, which is obviously what we want. The sprockets don't look too bad, and hopefully the less than perfect teeth can be hidden with the tracks. Before we can get to the tracks though, we really need some wheels. The idler wheels are just as easy to put together as the drive sprockets, and obviously we don't have to worry about any damaged teeth here. Next, I install the drive sprockets, and looking back, gluing these into place probably wasn't the best idea. I would actually suggest leaving them loose until you come to install the tracks. Fortunately, for once, this didn't bite me in the arse, but it is worth warning about the possibility of ill-fitting tracks due to immovable drive sprockets. I glue the idler wheels into place at the front of the hull, which is of course very simple, and there's minimal play in this part, so you shouldn't have any issues with it being nice and straight when you try to put the tracks on. While we let that bond, it's time to assemble the road wheels. We take this pile, and making sure that we have one of each inner and outer wheel, glue them together. The keying makes this quite easy to do. These are really nice looking wheels if you ask me. I sure didn't ask you. Well, I'm telling you anyway. Here's the pile of wheels we end up with, enough to put 5 wheels on each side of the tank. Just how a Comet should be. A couple of extra spare wheels as stowage might have been nice, but that's hardly worth complaining about. I glue all the road wheels into place, which is pretty easy, though I did have to do some nudging because there is a little bit of play to these. But as with the return rollers, this isn't anything too tricky. Eventually, we get all of the wheels into place, and it's time to install the tracks. This isn't too tricky really, and you can do this in any way you see fit, but I start by joining 7 of the individual links together. I join them together on the table, then I add glue. Unfortunately, they won't stay together without the glue. Then, before it sets, I quickly mount them onto the drive sprocket, as close as possible to where the instructions show they should be. Make sure the teeth of the drive sprocket properly mesh with the tracks. I follow that with the long upper run of tracks. This is pretty easy. Just apply pressure across the part to make sure that it's in contact with the return rollers. Then comes the shorter section of track that runs down from the drive sprocket to the road wheels. Again, pretty simple stuff. The long run that goes along the bottom comes next, and you obviously want this to be in contact with all of the road wheels. Then I add the individual links at the front to the return roller. There's also 7 links here, and you could do this the same way as I did the links at the rear, or if you fancy a change, which I hear is as good as a holiday, you could stick them on one at a time, as I've done here. The final piece is another shorter length running down to the forward road wheel. I added this last because it will allow a bit of wiggle room in completing the loop. I didn't need to do too much nudging here, and everything fit pretty well, which is obviously nice. As you can see, we've ended up with a pretty nice looking set of tracks, though you'll probably notice that it did take me a while to put the tracks on the other side. Moving right along, it's time to add some stuff to the upper front hull part, starting with this handle. I don't know what this is, but it goes into place here, like so. There are some very tiny guides for this part, which do help, though I still had to do a bunch of nudging and poking with my knife. Next, I glue the machine gun into place. This part slides in from the rear. Nothing too tricky here, just make sure that it's the right way up. Again, I really like that the end of this barrel has been slide molded. It's a very nice detail. Next comes this little hatch for the driver to look through. If you wanted, you could probably model this open, though obviously I've got it closed. We don't want any stray bullets finding their way in there now, do we? I follow that by gluing the angled vent, whatever they're called, things to the sides of the engine deck. You might need to apply a bit of pressure to get these to sit against the hull side properly, but they're pretty easy to get into place. Then I install the hull front assembly that we just put together. This is yet another simple thing to install. Then I decided to join the upper and lower hull parts together. This is easy and there are guide pins for it, though you might find you need to apply some pressure. I'm doing this a bit before the instructions say to do so, but, and I have regretted this in the past, I don't see any harm in doing so now. And I figure there's less risk of damaging bits while trying to glue the hull parts together if I do so before installing said easily damaged parts. Parts like these headlamps. These were a bit fiddly to install, though tweezers did help. Obviously with a rounded part like these in tweezers you've got to be careful, or they will go flying. But I did manage to install these without them taking an unintended flight to visit the floor monster. I then install this, which I think is a mirror on a small pole. I'm not totally sure I got this in the right place, but it's close enough. This was kind of fiddly to get into place. Next, I add the sides for the doors at the front here. Are these doors or hatches? Hatch doors? Door hatches. Whatever, the side parts go into place nice and easily. Now it's time to add some tools. On the right side of the engine deck, I add this large, weird hockey stick looking thing. This probably has a name like Robert or something, but I don't know what that name is. It does go into place easily though. On the other side of the hull, I install this bar. I don't know if you might call it a tanker bar, or a pry bar, or a crowbar, but it is some kind of a bar, and again, it's easy to get into place. Then I install this shovel, but I forgot to hit record. Also, I broke the part while trying to clean it up, and you can see that it's not quite perfect where I've glued it back together. I would definitely suggest being careful with this part. It's nice and thin and that does look good, though there are obviously downsides to that. Next, I install the cover for the air intake. There's nothing too tricky here, just make sure that you install it with the slightly higher end towards the front as I've done. Behind that goes the travel lock for the main gun. This is simple enough. Stowage boxes come next, and there's one of these very easy to install boxes on either side of the hull. There are handy dandy guide pins that slot neatly into some mounting holes for these. How convenient. A little bit more fiddly to install are these bracket things that go onto the lower front hull. Tweezers were a good choice here. This is where we'll mount some shackles later on, but before that I want to leave them to bond for a bit. That way they can't be accidentally knocked out of place while installing said shackles. While that happens, why not install the brush guards over the headlamps? This was a little bit fiddly as you can imagine, but again, tweezers were helpful. And now I install the shackles. These go on pretty much exactly the same way as the ones on the rear did, which is to say, very easily. Again, position them in such a way that it looks like gravity is doing gravitational things to them. Next, I install the rear mudguards. The rear section of this went into place with no problems at all. However, when I went to put the side parts on, I discovered the tracks protruded out a bit too far and prevented the side parts from going into place. I took care of this problem with my knife. That is to say, I trimmed down the sides of the tracks, obviously only the sections that would be behind the skirt, and then it fit nicely. I guess it was scared I was going to cut it some more. I think maybe I didn't push the drive sprockets on far enough or something like that. Who knows? At least it wasn't very difficult to fix. The problem did occur on both sides of the tank. Fortunately, it did not exist at the front, where I again installed some small sections of side skirt. I was quite pleased with how nice and easily these went on. Back toward the rear of the hull, I install the exhaust cowlings. There's a choice to be made here, either the twin cowlings like I've used, or a single long one much like you would find on a Cromwell. I feel like the twin cowlings look more comety. There's no keying for these, so you've got to eyeball them to get the positioning right, which isn't too difficult. Next comes this box thing on the hull rear. This is easy to position thanks to the keying. I'm pretty sure it's an infantry phone or a first aid box, or maybe both. Above that I mount this little arm thing. I have no idea what this is, and it was a little bit fiddly to place, even with tweezers, but I got there in the end. On the lower rear plate I install this. I guess it's like a leaf spring for the towing hook. You can tell that I forgot to install this while building the hull because there's a completed turret in the background. Silly forgetful Herbert. Also, this is easy to install. The towing hook goes into place in the mounting hole, give it a bit of a nudge and it's nicely in place. That's the hull pretty much completed, except for some photo etch, but we'll do that at the end of the video because I didn't feel like doing it at this point. The instructions disapproved, but I'm a rebel. A rebel who is now going to use the instructions to build a turret. I start with the mantlet, through which I insert the machine gun. I then glue the backing part into the turret front part. I'm not sure if it's possible to put this together in such a way that you can elevate and depress the gun, but I was never going to do that anyway, so I didn't give it much thought. Then I glue the main gun into place. Obviously I've chosen to use the metal gun, because who wouldn't, it looks great. Because it's metal, superglue has to be used here. Plastic cement rudely refuses to work with metal. Next, I slid the mantlet over the gun. I don't think this is the way that you're actually meant to do this, and I did have to use some force to get the gun through the hole, but I did get it through. Once I was satisfied with how things were sitting, I added glue and set the assembly aside to bond. Then I glue the upper and lower halves of the turret together. These parts fit together very nicely, so this isn't at all difficult. Hatches come next, and these pretty much just drop right into place. These hatch parts are both a single piece, so if you want to model them open, you'll need to cut them in half. No crew figures come with the kit and there's no interior, so I don't see much point in doing that, but you could if you wanted. Next, I glue some sets of spare track links to either side of the turret. There's nothing to guide this, but I think I got them in the right spot anyway. Then I glue the front assembly onto the turret. At the front. Yes, quite surprising, I know. This is easy enough to do. A little bit of pressure to make sure there's no unwanted gaps, and it's on. The final step, at least as far as the plastic goes, is to install the searchlight on the left side of the turret. Nice and easy. Now it's time for the photo etch. Well, it's not, you're meant to do this while building, but I didn't want to, so I didn't. You can tell I did this later because the lighting is quite different. Anyway, the first bit I added was this pair of platey things that go on some of the bracing towards the rear of the tank. This was surprisingly, at least to me, fiddly to get into place, and really it could have been plastic parts. That would have made things a lot easier. Next, at the front, another two plates, this time curved, that are mounted atop some vertical parts. I think these are intended for holding ropes or cables in place or something like that. This was also fiddly, and I would have preferred them to be plastic. I think I would have made a bit less mess if they were plastic. Also, there was meant to be a small bit above the tank's right-hand headlamp somewhere, but I forgot and I'm not convinced that it really makes that big a difference. Atop the driver and machine gunner's hatches we add these. I guess they're hinge details or something. Whatever they are, they go here, though I'm not 100% sure I got the correct placement, but it is close to what the instructions were showing. Next, we have the tops of the vision devices. These are simple round flat parts that go on top of the vision devices. It was actually kind of tricky to get these on facing the right way, and it probably won't surprise you to hear me say that this would have been a bit easier to do in plastic. You get more working time with plastic. None of these are perfectly in place, but I suppose they'll do. The last piece on the hull is this flat plate that we had to put a 90-ish degree bend in. This isn't hard, though there was no marking on it where exactly to bend. There is a guide on the hull to help with positioning, so this wasn't too much of a challenge to install after bending it. Now, back to the turret. In addition to photo etch, a couple of holes need to be drilled in the lift points on the turret. Well, you could just not do this, but I chose to because I can, and it does really look a lot better. The instructions say to use a 0.7mm drill bit here, but I used a 0.6mm one because of reasons. Doesn't really make that much of a difference, I don't think. This is a pretty simple task, but it does add a little something, so no complaints from me. As you can hopefully see, there are more photo etch vision device tops here. They go on the same as on the hull, and the same comments I made about those apply here as well. Next, I add the commander's vane side. This was kind of fiddly to fold, but for some reason I wasn't able to video myself doing this in any sort of competent manner. But I did get it folded. It's not especially neat, but it's done. It would have been nice if there were some instructions around how this should be folded in the instructions, but there isn't. Fortunately, the part does have marks where it should be bent, and that was helpful. I do like this part because these are thin pieces of metal on the real thing, and plastic doesn't often do that justice, so the bit of fiddliness was worth it in my opinion. Still, it would have been nice if there were optional parts for this in plastic, like with the main gun. There was also an antenna mount that was made up of two pieces of photo etch, a pair of circles with leg bits that you were meant to bend into shape and then glue together, but I decided for the sake of my own sanity, what little I have left, that I would just not do that. Unfortunately, again, there were no plastic counterparts, and that means that there's no antenna mount. I'm sure that's going to upset some rivet counters, but I can live with that. With that, the 72nd scale A34 Comet cruiser tank by Vespid Models is now completed, and I'm pretty happy with how this model has turned out, though I do think some of the photo etch was a bit photo etch for the sake of photo etch. though I suppose that isn't really the worst thing in the world. It did take me a fair while to get this model completed, not just in the length of time and number of streams it took. The actual build time wasn't all that long really, but it did take me a fair bit of time to get the motivation to finish it by adding the photo etch at the end. And maybe that was a mistake. It might have been quicker to do that when the instructions said to. Oh well, what's done is done. If you've been around for a while, you'll know that photo etch isn't really my favourite thing in the world. But I did get it done in the end, and now the video is here, and I'm happy with the result. I think the model will look much cooler when it's painted, obviously, or even just primed, so the photo etch parts are blended in and no longer standing out like a sore thumb. That said, I don't have any plans to paint this soon, because my Rubicon Comet will be painted first. In fact, it's already underway, so painting another Comet isn't really a priority. Anyway, this kit wasn't too difficult to build, though some of the parts are fairly thin and easily broken, so I would definitely recommend taking care when removing and cleaning up the parts. For that reason, and the photo etch, I probably wouldn't recommend this to a beginner, but it shouldn't be too hard for most modelers with a little bit of experience to deal with, and you should get a lot of satisfaction out of it if you do choose to build this kit. I know I did. The detail is nice and crisp, and while I'm clearly no rivet counter or comet scientist, in regards to accuracy, I think it's pretty convincing. I suspect this kit is almost identical to Vespid's other Comet kit, the Mark 1B. The main difference between the Mark 1A and 1B that I'm aware of is the exhausts protrude from the rear of the hull on the Mark B, and for that reason it lacks the exhaust deflecting cowls on the engine deck. For that reason I won't be building that kit from Vespid, but I do look forward to more releases from them in the future. I think for their first two releases, this and their mouse, they're well on their way to being a very good quality manufacturer. I have no idea what their future releases might be, but I will certainly be keeping an eye out, and probably buying them and building them in fairly short order. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the comments section below. I hear it's pretty good for that. If you've built one of these or any other cool models and you want to share, why not drop by our Discord community and show some pictures? We would love to see what you've done. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this live, head on over to my Twitch channel where I build models fairly regularly. The link is in the description below. And if you've not already done so, why not subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a patron, or maybe just come say hi on Discord or Twitch. Links to all of my things are in the description below, and, as always, I shall return soon. So, until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.